It's at this moment that Anakin decides, this sucks, my life sucks, I don't want to do this anymore. And so he leaves his old identity behind as Anakin Skywalker. He leaves that entire life behind and becomes Darth Vader. You're listening to
Path of the Jedi
with your host, Ronnie Cruz. All right, welcome to episode number 5. We have made it to episode number 5. I really should have thought this thing out much better when I decided to start a podcast. Launching it this time of year, which typically is the busiest time of year for me, or one of the busier times of year for me. And on top of that, I just was on a massive 2-week road trip. So juggling, creating what I didn't realize would be as time intensive of a project as a podcast is during everything that's been going on has been a little bit of a challenge on top of this whole adventure being a massive learning curve. However, now that I am at episode 5, I think that's much reason to celebrate, much cause, for celebration, because we've made it to number 5, right? Even though that seems a small win, I will take it. Starting to get into a groove as far as recording goes. My technique, balances are a little bit better. And as I said, guys, this is just going to get better and better as we go. So thank you for tuning in to our 5th episode of Path of the Jedi. Okay, so let's kick it off with news and updates. Another massive, well, not really massive in the grand scheme of things, not massive, but relatively for me, because this is a brand new podcast, it's big news. We have, as of this recording, reached 150 downloads, guys. So thank you so much. That is, again, cause for celebration, and it really is thanks to all of you who have supported us from the very beginning and continue to support us even though we're just 2 weeks in. I can't express enough how grateful I am for you guys, and I promise I will continue to work harder and harder so that I could get better and better at providing you guys value and content and a podcast that you'll continue to enjoy for years and years to come. Next piece of news: we are officially on Twitter. That's right, Path of the Jedi has a Twitter account now. You can follow us at POTJ Podcast. That is, again, POTJ Podcast Twitter account. Well, now we have another place for you guys to send us questions, comments, insights, reflections, anything that you want to talk about under the sun. You can reach out to us and connect with us on Twitter. Again, if you are on Twitter, find us at POTJ Podcast. Now, a little bit of Star Wars news for all my fellow geeks out there. Congratulations to The Mandalorian for their 7 Emmy Award wins this past weekend, where they had actually a whopping 24 nominations in all and took home 7 of those. You can find out more details and read the longer article at starwars.com. I will leave the link in the show notes of this particular episode. But again, congratulations to everyone involved in The Mandalorian. It's a phenomenal show, guys. I would say, in my opinion, this show alone, The Mandalorian, is worth the cost of the Disney Plus subscription. So if you haven't seen it, sign up for Disney Plus. And this isn't like a paid endorsement or anything. I'm not getting paid by Disney or Lucasfilm to say any of this. I just love it that much. And I think if you guys hop on this, if you haven't seen it yet, that is, and you hop on it, you're going to absolutely love it. In other Star Wars geek news, if you happen to be on the market for another podcast, I just happened upon a new, it's not new. They've actually been around longer than I have, way longer than I have. But in my homework, so to speak, in my own self-education, as I'm trying to expose myself more to the social spheres and the Star Wars spheres and the fandom spheres, I happened upon this podcast called The Geeky Bubble Podcast. It's a daughter and mother duo. It's Jonna Marie and her mother Maria, and they are Yeah, I mean, first of all, incredibly fun and entertaining. Just full of laughter and incredibly enjoyable to listen to. Also, incredible analysis, right? Incredible analysis, in-depth analysis, and insights of all things Star Wars. They started off reviewing and giving their reactions to Star Wars Rebels, which those are the episodes I'm on right now. The current episodes, I believe, they're covering the Bad Batch, right? Star Wars, the Bad Batch. So again, incredibly entertaining, incredibly insightful. They really know their Star Wars stuff. So much fun. And you can tell that they have they both do, right? And it's incredible that it's a daughter mother duo that you don't really see that very often. But you can tell they have a deep love for all things Star Wars. So again, go check them out. The Geeky Bubble podcast. I will leave their link in the show notes for this episode. And now it's that part of the show that we dedicate to shout outs. And you know what? Now that I think about it, I should include some kind of music in this. Anyways, next episode. For today, I want to give a huge shout out to my niece, Jade De Leon. I just wanted to send a thank you to JD for, being incredible, for one. So I don't want all my other nieces and nephews to get jealous. I will say and admit that all my nieces and nephews are amazing, but I wanted to give a special shout out and thank you to Jade because she called me the other day to say how much she is enjoying the podcast. And, I just wanted to express to her and recognize her on here publicly and let her know how much that means to me, how important it is for me to hear that kind of feedback, especially from somebody that I care about. So thank you again, JD, so much for, for listening, for one, right? Listening to your crazy uncle ramble on this podcast about Star Wars. And for two, for letting me know how much you're enjoying it. So guys, JD is an amazing realtor here in North Carolina. So for any of you guys here who are, any of my listeners here in North Carolina who are looking for a realtor to represent them, I will leave a link to Jade's Instagram in the show notes of this episode. All right. In this episode, I want to tackle the concept of identity in the Star Wars universe. Now, this idea popped in my head because I was listening to an episode of the Geeky Bubble podcast, in fact, on our long road trip. And John Marie and her mother Maria were discussing Anakin versus Darth Vader, right? Whether Anakin no longer exists and how that fits into play with Darth Vader or vice versa, or is it one person, or, all kinds of questions, right? Like, because there's always that conversation, well, is Anakin still around? And then that got me thinking, the Sith are always the ones creating new identities for themselves, right? When they fully embrace the dark side of the Force, they create a whole new identity, a whole different name. Now, sorry, I got to backtrack here. For all my non-Star Wars listeners, Sith is an individual who uses the dark side of the Force, the dark side Force wielders. You have your Jedi, they use the light side. Sith use the dark side, right? Like your Darth Vader, the Emperor, things like that, right? And Sith, they go through this process when they fully embrace the dark side. They give themselves Sith names, right? Like give themselves new identities. Count Dooku is Darth Tyrannus. Of course, Anakin becomes Darth Vader. The most recent is Ben Kenobi becomes Kylo Ren. So you have this pattern with the Sith or people or individuals who, through some kind of acceptance of the dark side and fully giving themselves to the dark side, create new identities. And so that really got my brain churning about identity and what the concept of identity in Star Wars really is. And so that's what I want to dive into today, and touch us back on episode 1 when I was introducing myself to you guys and explaining to you, or at least answering the question, who am I? Now, in terms of identity, I think in the broadest sense, we can say that identity is the definition that we have of ourselves, right? For example, referencing back to episode 1 again, I am a network marketer. I am a musician. I am an actor. I am a podcaster. I am a male. I am Filipino. I am American. I have all these definitions of myself. Am I really all those things? Am I none of those things, right? The questions that I asked in episode 1. Now, I think we can dissect that a little further and say that these definitions, what are those definitions comprised of? Identity, I think, is mindsets, right? Belief systems, behavioral patterns that make us, or that make up, quote unquote, who we are, right? And this is incredibly important. Like, this conversation is important because it's that identity that we have of ourselves, consciously and unconsciously, mostly unconsciously, right? The identities that we hold of ourselves that really determine our outcomes, right? The outcomes and the results that we have in our lives are determined by our identities, because it is those belief systems, it is those mindsets, and therefore the behavioral patterns that dictate our actions and our habits and our day-to-day decisions. And those things are what create the results and the outcomes that we have in our lives, right? Where we are in our lives is a direct result of the identities that we hold and have of ourselves, again, consciously, but mostly unconsciously. As an example, let's take a look at Anakin Skywalker. We've been talking about Anakin and Darth Vader anyway. So when we meet Anakin in episode 1, he and his mother were slaves. They were slaves that belonged to the character Watto. And that was pretty much it. That was their existence. He didn't have a father. It was just him and his mother, and probably would have lived out the rest of his existence as such, right? As a slave, because that was all he knew. That was the only life he knew. That was the identity that he had of himself. Now, this is all disrupted when Qui-Gon Jinn and Padme Amidala come into their lives. And Qui-Gon, senses that Anakin is very strong in the Force and finds a way to win Anakin's freedom. So at this moment, Anakin goes from being a slave to being a young boy who is free, but is now an orphan, because Qui-Gon takes him away from his home planet of Tatooine to Coruscant so that he can go see and meet the Jedi Council. So all this time, his identity during Phantom Menace is as an orphan in this crazy adventure, completely foreign world with people that he doesn't know, in the care of the wise and powerful Jedi Master Qui-Gon Jinn. Anakin is further orphaned when, at the end of Phantom Menace, Qui-Gon gets killed by Darth Maul. Fortunately, Obi-Wan Kenobi takes him under his wing as his Padawan. And so from here forward, Anakin's new identity is that of a Padawan, as a growing Jedi, as the chosen one, as one of the most powerful Force users in the entire Jedi Order. Now, there are some very important lessons we can learn from Anakin's example. The first is that a lot of our identity or identities are formed during our developmental years, and sometimes even into our younger or early adulthood. We get our identities through the people, modeling the people that we're around the most, through significant emotional events, through things that we're told repeatedly. All this stuff, all this information, all this input through those years we're taking in, and we're forming our identities with this information. With Anakin, the fact that he was a slave, the fact that, he had to leave his mother at a very young age, the fact that he was told that he was the chosen one, the fact that he became a very powerful Jedi. And when you look at his role models and the people that were around him growing up, you have Obi-Wan Kenobi, you have Yoda, you have the Jedi Council. He's always surrounded by politicians. He has Chancellor Palpatine, right? These were his role models. And what's funny, actually, now that I think about it, you'd never really see Anakin around any contemporaries, anybody his age, any of the other Padawans or younglings, right? So you have this messy soup of influences that make up who Anakin is. And so it's no wonder that he is the most volatile individual in the entire galaxy, right? It's not so much an issue when he's younger. I think our responsibility as adults to children is, to teach them, to show them, to guide them, to be an example for them. But as Anakin gets older and as he starts thinking for himself, the world around him becomes more and more restrictive in his eyes as his power grows, right? All the while, Chancellor Palpatine is manipulating him more and more. The war against the Separatists is ever escalating. And to top it all off, his secret wife, who is pregnant with twins, decides to leave him. It's at this moment that Anakin decides, this sucks, my life sucks, I don't want to do this anymore. And so he leaves his old identity behind as Anakin Skywalker. He leaves that entire life behind and becomes Darth Vader, which brings me to my second lesson that we can learn from Anakin is that identities aren't permanent, right? They're not concrete. They can change over time. They can actually change very abruptly if we want them to. So if you hear anybody say, you can't teach an old dog new tricks, or I'm just set in my ways, you can call BS on it because it's just not true. Not if you don't want it to be. And in fact, all of us go through some sort of evolution and change of identity through the course of our lives. I mean, it's just a natural progression of things. It may seem imperceptible because the change of identity is very, very gradual, but it's there and it happens nonetheless. You can see this gradual changing of identities or evolution of identities with any one of the Jedis if you look at it. Obi-Wan, for example, he starts off when we first meet him in Phantom Menace as a Padawan. He then becomes a Jedi Knight, eventually becoming a Jedi Master and part of the Jedi Council. And then when we see him in Episode 4, after everything happens with the Clone Wars and the Empire is formed, he goes into exile and then becomes a hermit on the desert planet of Tatooine. So with the Jedi, we see a more gradual and perhaps intentional and purposeful evolution of identity, change in identity. It's really more of a path of growth, right? With the Sith, it's more abrupt, it's more conflicted, it's more violent. And not only do you have to figuratively, that's a hard word, figuratively kill all the things that you were holding on to in the past to become this new identity, but you have to actually kill some things literally, right? Like we see in The Force Awakens when Kylo Ren, in the very, very heartbreaking moment where he kills his own father, where he kills Han Solo. Now, the thing about identities isn't so much that they can't change, but rather it's that they're very difficult to change intentionally. Because, and I learned this from my mentor, Rod Hairston, the strongest force in human nature is to stay consistent with the identity you hold of yourself. And that's why we have sayings like, I'm just set in my ways, because it's easier not to change than to change. It's easier not to grow than to grow. So if you want to make a change in your life, if you want new outcomes, it's gonna take work. The good thing is, the things that we've learned from Star Wars has actually given us the exact formula. Number one, be mindful of your environment. Be mindful of the people you spend the most time with, because you will ultimately start modeling and adapting their mindsets and belief systems. Anakin grew up around the Jedi. He grew up around the Council. He grew up around soldiers. He grew up around politicians. He never really was exposed to any children at all or spent much time with them. So not only did he grow up and have a tumultuous childhood, he actually didn't really have much of a childhood in the first place. Number two, be mindful of your conditioning, right? The things that you're listening to, the things that you're hearing and seeing and reading on a regular basis, the things that you're even telling yourself on a regular basis, those things that you affirm to yourself. This is very, very important. Again, with Anakin, the Jedi and the Jedi Council were always telling him conflicting things. You're very powerful, but you're too emotional. You're the chosen one, but you're too unpredictable. We'll let you become a Jedi Master, but you can't be on the Jedi Council. And all the while, Chancellor Palpatine was just feeding his anger, feeding his frustration, feeding his doubts. And the last one, significant emotional events. Significant emotional events, good or bad, really make an imprint in our identities. Once again, using Anakin as the example, it's one significant emotional event after the other. I mean, he was taken away from his mom at a very young age and therefore orphaned, taken off the planet, was thrust into a war, and then the individual that was supposed to take care of him gets killed. And this is all just in the first movie. In the second movie, not only does he lose his mother again, but he loses his arm. In the third movie, not only does he lose his best friend, not only does he lose his pregnant wife, but he loses his 2 legs and his good arm. It's all these things, right? His environment, his conditioning, his significant emotional events. These are the things that culminated in the creation and forming of his identity as Darth Vader. So it's not that Anakin died and became Vader and that they're 2 different people. Anakin, the person, is alive. He just changed. He changed as a result of all the trauma that he continually experienced from his very early childhood to when the time that he got his arms and legs cut off. And he developed that identity of Vader to protect himself from all that pain and suffering that he had experienced. Hopefully, none of us have to go through the things that Anakin went through in his life that caused him to change into Darth Vader. The point is, we can change if we want to. We can develop new identities if we want to. Now, you might be asking, well, why is this even important? I'm good. I don't need to change my identity. To which my answer would be this. Number one, this episode primarily is for people who, as I mentioned earlier, are looking to create new results and outcomes in their lives. People who are setting new visions and setting new goals, because the fulfillment of those visions and those goals will happen sooner and much more freely when you create an identity that is congruent with those visions and those goals. Number two, you might think that you don't need to change and that you're good, but I guarantee you that the people and the world around you are changing and evolving. And if you don't evolve with it, you're going to wake up one morning and you're going to find that the world has left you behind. So change, grow, evolve. The path ahead of you isn't fixed. You can start taking steps right now to create the future that you want, any future that you want. And it all starts with creating a new identity. And luckily, you don't have to have a Jedi cut off your limbs to make it happen.
This party's over.
And that's going to do it for today's episode. What do you guys think, right? Do you have any questions, comments, insights, reflections? Let me know. You can send me a letter or send me an letter. Who does that anymore? Send me an email or an MP3. You can send it to info@pathofthejedi.com. Or if you're on Twitter, you can connect with us there. Again, it's at POTJ Podcast. If you're on Facebook, come join our Facebook community. It's facebook.com/POTJ Podcast. It's been an incredible pleasure again hanging out with you this week. We will catch you again next week with another awesome episode. Until then, be well, be safe, and may the Force be with you. This podcast is not endorsed by the Walt Disney Company nor Lucasfilm Limited and is intended for entertainment, educational, and informational purposes only. The official Star Wars website can be found at www.starwars.com. Star Wars, all names and sounds and any other Star Wars related items are registered trademarks and or copyrights of Disney and their respective trademark and copyright holders. All original content of this podcast is intellectual property of Path of the Jedi unless otherwise indicated.